This is Autism and the Structure of Reality. This is part 11. Every transformation contains a funeral. This episode, we're going to talk about change and how change is hard. Transformation is hard, even when recognized, even when you know it's better. And at the end of the last episode, we were left with a question. What are you carrying? And perhaps even more importantly, who would you be without it? But that question creates another problem. If the burden has become part of the self, if the burden has become part of the policy within the self, how do you let it go? And why does letting go hurt so much? Perhaps that is why one of the most mysterious statements in the Beatitudes is, "Blessed are those who mourn." For all of the Beatitudes, this may be the strangest. We cover the Beatitudes in part 7. At least at first glance, this mourning is interesting because most of us understand why courage might be admirable, why mercy might be admirable, why humility might be admirable. But mourning? Why mourning be blessed? Why would grief be blessed? Why would loss be blessed? You might think of it as being supportive for one another during a loss, during a death. But this statement is a little bit backwards until we begin looking at it more carefully. Mourning is updating. When most people hear the word grief, they immediately think of death, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a relationship, the loss of something precious to them. And certainly, grief includes those experiences. But I think grief may be much larger than that, because grief appears whenever reality changes, and the self must change with it. A relationship ends. A dream ends. Certainty disappears and collapses. A story stops working. An identity begins to crack. And suddenly the mind faces a difficult task. Updating. One of the themes running throughout this entire series has been that human beings do not simply react to reality. We do not react to the world. We react to the predictions we have of the world, our expectations, our assumptions, our internal models. We covered this in a pretty good 2-part whiteboard episode called The Internal Calculators. And then we extended that on to part 3 and part 4 as well. So there's pretty good neurobiology explanation of what I'm talking about with the habits. Remember, the central nervous system does not like to work. It just wants to respond. It conserves biological energy. This is at the root of everything that we're talking about. We just respond based off of our experiences, based off of these internal models, based off of these policies. And in part 8, we explored how repetition gradually stabilizes those models. Repeated predictions become expectations. Repeated expectations become habits. Repeated habits become the policy. We map this out toward the dorsal striatum and the basal ganglia, our go, no-go area, where we don't have to think. We just respond, we just do, we just act. Repeated habits become policies. And eventually, those policies become character. The pattern becomes the person. But what happens when reality refuses to cooperate with the model? What happens when life presents information that no longer fits the old policy? What happens when the old explanation stops working? The old identity stops working. The old story stops working. Something must be updated, and updating is rarely comfortable. For the autistic phenotype, this process can sometimes feel especially intense. The same pattern detection system that help reveal inconsistencies can also make the mismatch impossible to ignore. the same predictive machinery that helps organize reality, can become deeply invested in a particular model of reality. And when that model begins to fail, the experience is not merely intellectual. It can feel existential. The nervous system has invested enormous energy into that structure, that explanation. And the social norms is a big barrier that are preventing this explanation, preventing this expansion, preventing the wellness of the autistic phenotype's incredible mind. The story, that identity, and letting it go can feel like losing part of yourself. Not because it was true, not because it was healthy, but because it became familiar. And human beings often confuse familiar with truth. This is why I keep returning to this idea that mourning may be more than sadness. Mourning may be the emotional experience of updating, the emotional experience of releasing, the emotional experience of accepting that something can no longer remain. And perhaps that is why Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn." Because mourning is what allows movement. Mourning is what allows transformation. Mourning is what allows reality to replace illusion. The truth will set you free. Remember in part 7, we discussed how that mourning is emotional depth, your ability to go inward and recognize your true self. There's a funeral inside every transformation. Think about how often people become stuck because they refuse to grieve. They refuse to grieve the relationship, the identity, their dream, the injury, or that explanation, the version of themselves they thought they would become. And because they refuse to grieve it, they continue carrying it. Years and years later, every action, every day, every moment, it builds, sometimes decades, still carrying something that should have been buried long ago. Humans have to be cautious of what they attach their identity to. This is where I think all of these thinkers begin converging. For much of this series, we have explored these individuals separately and collectively. Carl Jung, Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Jesus Christ. Different centuries, different languages, different assumptions, different starting points even. And yet, here they seem to arrive at a remarkably similar conclusion. Jung saw that the persona, the mask at once helped us navigate the world, can eventually become the very thing that confines us, again with the attaching our identity. The adaptation becomes identity. The defense becomes identity. The self forgets that it is ever wearing a mask. Kierkegaard saw human beings standing at the threshold of possibility, longing for change, praying for change, talking about change, yet retreating from it. Not because transformation was impossible, but because freedom itself can be terrifying. Because freedom demands responsibility, and responsibility demands becoming. You have to be different, and social norms do not like differences. The system will change the individual before the system updates. Nietzsche saw the old self defending itself against transformation. He saw how resentment, uncertainty, and familiar limitations often become more important than freedom itself. He saw how human beings frequently protect the very things that prevent their growth. And Dostoevsky saw something even much deeper, perhaps even strange. He saw suffering become identity. A wound becomes a story, The story becomes a lens. The lens becomes a self. And eventually, the person no longer carries the burden. The burden begins carrying the person. There's a pretty good Dostoevsky quote that fits here. He said, "Man only likes to count his troubles. He doesn't calculate his happiness." And Jesus saw that transformation requires mourning. Something must be surrendered. Something must be released. Something must be left behind. Different languages, different philosophies, the same reality. Something must die so something else can live. Something must be released so something else can emerge. Something must be buried so something else can grow. There's a statement often attributed to Alfred North Whitehead, not previously talked about in these series. The purpose of thought is to allow our thoughts to die instead of us. Remember, we've talked about thoughts. They are human creations. All thoughts are just human creations. Think about that for a moment. The purpose of thought is to allow our thoughts or ideas to die instead of us. I'm going to keep explaining this over and over. Imagine yourself when you were 11, 12 to 14 months or so, and you first start learning to walk. You can only take a couple of steps and you fall down right on your butt. 3 steps, fall down. But you get back up. You take another couple of steps. 1, 2, 3 more steps and you fall down. But you get back up. You take a couple more steps and then you fall down. The only reliable thing is you're going to fall down on your butt. Imagine being a 12, 13-month-old baby and saying, "I can't do this. I'm not going to do this." And you never persist. You never keep going. The baby, the 12-month-old, can't have the negative self-talk. The baby, the 12-month-old, doesn't limit itself. Why do adults limit themselves? The baby gets back up and he learns to take more and more steps. And then eventually he walks. There's no limitation. There's no "I can't. I quit." Humans being used, abused, and experienced, and having the capacity, more so than anything, to have the negative self-talk, to bail out, is harmful. Now, in the last episode, I read directly from Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, essay number 40 from Free Spirit. Today, I'm going to read directly from essay 34, because it fits. Nietzsche asked, why couldn't the world that concerns us be a fiction? And if someone asked, but to a fiction, there surely belongs an author, couldn't one answer simply, why? Doesn't this so-called belongings, in quote, perhaps belong to that fiction too? Now, Nietzsche is very underrated. He's not just nihilism. He's truth-seeking. Perhaps one of the great tragedies of human life is that we often reverse this process. We keep the idea alive and allow ourselves to suffer. We keep the resentment alive. We keep that fear alive. It's all human creation. We keep the explanation alive and we keep that identity alive. We love to attach to an identity. We keep those wounds alive and then wonder why we remain trapped, because letting the idea die can feel terrifying, especially when the idea has become part of the policy we have practiced for years. Think about this exercise for a moment. This is a physical limitation exercise. You're standing up and you're falling down. Eventually, you're going to stick your foot out and catch yourself. You're probably not going to allow yourself to fall that far. For physical limitations, for physical threats, you will stop yourself. For mental threats, you will allow your mind to expand into the infinite capacity that it has. Why don't you stop yourself in the mental aspect similarly to the physical aspect? If I let go of the resentment, who am I? If I let go of the shame, well then who am I? If I let go of the story, who am I? If I let go of the burden, who am I? And perhaps this is why transformation feels so much like death. Because in some ways it is. Not physical death, but psychological death. The death of an explanation, the death of a certainty, the death of a familiar identity, the death of a version of yourselves. Every transformation contains a funeral. Forgiveness is release. And this is where one of those most difficult ideas in this entire episode enters. Forgiveness. Not forgiveness as morality. Not forgiveness as an obligation. Not forgiveness as pretending something never happened. But forgiveness as release. In a future episode, we're going to parse this out in more detail with the Lord's Prayer. But for now, forgiveness as putting something down. Forgiveness as refusing to carry tomorrow what should have been left behind yesterday. Forgiveness is one of those most misunderstood words in the modern world. Many people hear forgiveness and immediately think approval or excusing, forgetting, pretending. But psychologically, I think forgiveness may be something much simpler and much more difficult. Forgiveness is saying, I will not carry this anymore. Not because it was acceptable, not because it did not matter, not because it was fair, but because continuing to carry it is costing me too much. This is why I ask, and you ought to ask yourself, who owns you? Or what owns you? Think about how much of human suffering comes from carrying things long after the event itself is over. The conversation happened years ago. The betrayal happened years ago. The rejection happened years ago. The mistake you made happened years ago. The injury happened years ago. Yet the mind continues returning to it, rehearsing it, revisiting it, recalculating it, paying for it again and again and again. The event is over, but the burden remains. Some debts are paid long after the event is over, and perhaps forgiveness is the decision to stop making the payments. There is a story in the Gospels that I think captures this idea perfectly. The rich young ruler approaches Jesus and asks, what is missing? What stands behind him in the life he seeks? What stands behind him in transformation? And eventually, Jesus identifies the thing he cannot surrender, the thing he cannot release, the thing he cannot put down. The story is often interpreted as a lesson about money, but I think something much deeper is happening, because the problem was not wealth itself. The problem was attachment. The problem was that the burden had become part of the self. And when Jesus asked him to release it, the young man walks away sad, not angry, not confused, but sad. Because somewhere deep down, he already knew. He knew exactly what was being asked of him. And he knew he was not ready to let it go. I think everyone has a version of that story. For some people, it is the resentment. For some people, it is shame. For some people, it is certainty. For some people, it is an old wound. For some people, it is fear. For some people, it is an identity that once protected them. The burden changes. The structure remains the same. There is always something we are tempted to carry long after it has become too heavy. Matthew 11:29, take my yoke. It's not just any yoke, folks. It's Jesus's yoke. And perhaps this is why Jesus repeatedly speaks about burdens, not merely behavior, not merely morality, burdens, weights, things people carry. Because carrying something long enough changes you. It changes how you think. It changes how you interpret reality. It changes how you interpret yourself. And eventually it becomes difficult to remember what life felt like before the burden arrived. This is why one of the most beautiful invitations in the Gospels is also one of the simplest. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Heavy laden. Think about that phrase. Not distracted, not confused, not imperfect. Heavy. Carrying too much. Trying to move through life while burdened by things that were never meant to be carried forever. It's not your fault. Let it go. Your life is valuable and worthy. And perhaps this is where forgiveness becomes something far more practical than many people realize. Because forgiveness does not change the past. The past remains what it was. Forgiveness does not rewrite history. Forgiveness does not erase the consequences. Forgiveness does not magically remove pain, but forgiveness changes what you continue carrying in the future. And that is a profound difference. Because the future is where transformation happens, not the past. You are not in the past. You cannot be in the past. There's a courage to bury what no longer belongs. As we bring this episode to a close, I want to return to the question that has followed us from the very beginning. Why is change so difficult? Not, why is information difficult? Not, why is insight so difficult? Not, why is learning difficult? Learning is probably too easy. That's what builds your policy. Why is transformation difficult? Because if transformation were simply a matter of knowing what to do, most people would already be transformed. Most people already know they should be more patient, be more forgiving, be more courageous, be more disciplined, be more honest, be more aligned. The problem is rarely information. The problem is surrender. Part 8 showed us that repetition builds the character. Repeated thoughts become expectations. Repeated expectations become habits. Repeated habits become those policies. And repeated policies becomes the architecture of the self, your core beliefs, your phenotype, your personality. Part 9 talked about the Kierkegaard relationship and with despair. And Jung has showed us the mask. And Kierkegaard showed us the self is refusing itself. Nietzsche showed us the old self defended itself. Dostoevsky showed us suffering becomes identity. And all of them pointed towards the same problem. Human beings become attached to things that no longer serve them. This episode introduces what happens next. But we've talked about the 3 temptations and the transformation to the Beatitudes. Yet, even the reader, even the Christian reader, fails with the execution. Because eventually transformation asks something of us. Not more information, not another explanation, not another theory. A release, a surrender, and a funeral. Jung saw this in the persona, the mask, that once protected us, eventually becomes the thing that confines us. And growth begins when we stop mistaking the mask for our face, for our true self. Now the system, the social norms, does not like that, but it takes courage. Kierkegaard saw it in despair, the self standing at the threshold of possibility. Take that step, longing for transformation, yet retreating from it because freedom feels frightening. Nietzsche saw it as self-overcoming, the old self refusing to die, the old self defending certainty, resentment, and limitation. Dostoevsky saw it in suffering, the wound becoming the story becoming identity, the identity becoming a person. Jesus simply said, "Blessed are those who mourn." It's the second line. The Beatitudes is the second line. The Sermon on the Mount comes right after. Blessed are those poor in spirit, which is humility, willingness, and openness. This is a progression, and it's needed. This is the way. Not because grief feels good, not because loss isn't enjoyable, but because mourning allows reality to replace the illusion. Mourning allows the self to update. Mourning allows transformation. Mourning allows the release. Every transformation contains a funeral. Not because something valuable is dying, but because something familiar is dying. And human beings often confuse familiar with truth. The resentment feels like part of us. The shame feels like part of us. The wound feels like part of us. The story feels like part of us. That explanation definitely feels like a part of us. The identity is us. And perhaps the goal of transformation is discovering what remains when those things no longer need to be carried. Perhaps the goal is not becoming someone else. Perhaps the goal is becoming more fully yourself. Perhaps this is why mourning is blessed. Mourning is the courage to release something, the courage to bury what can no longer remain, the courage to stop carrying tomorrow, what should have been left behind yesterday. So I want to leave you with a question. Not, who are you? Not, what happened to you? And not, what do you believe? But, what are you carrying? And perhaps even more importantly, ask yourself this. What are you unwilling to put down? Because sometimes the thing standing between us and transformation is the thing that we have convinced ourselves we cannot live without. And sometimes freedom begins the moment we discover that we can. Next time, we turn to one of the most famous prayers ever spoken, the Lord's Prayer, taken from the Sermon on the Mount again. Not simply as a prayer, but as an orientation towards reality itself. A guide for your attention. A guide for our value. A guide for what deserves to be carried. And what must finally be released. If you're listening to the podcast, listening to the episode, please feel free to leave a review or rating. In podcasting, reviews, ratings, and downloads are huge. I very much appreciate your feedback. You can contact me on X at RPS47586. You can email me info.fromthespectrum@gmail.com. You can check out the YouTube page for full-length videos, shorts, and clips. You can subscribe to the channel if you wish, but I don't necessarily care. But the information is there. Thank you for listening to From the Spectrum podcast. If you're raising a child with autism, you've probably experienced the confusion that comes with trying to make sense of it all. One expert says one thing, another says the opposite. And social media is full of opinions. Every week there's a new therapy, a new program, a new approach claiming to be the answer. And somewhere in the middle of all this noise, you're trying to figure out what's actually best for your child. That's why I recommend Lynn R. Curry and Elevate How You Navigate. Lynn is the father of an autistic son, host of the Autism Parenting Secrets podcast, and someone who understands firsthand how overwhelming the autism journey can be. His focus isn't on adding more noise. It's on helping parents gain clarity, confidence, and a practical path forward. Through his coaching and guidance, Lynn helps parents cut through the noise, sort through conflicting advice, and make decisions with greater confidence. The goal isn't to tell you what to think. It's to help you navigate your family's unique situation with greater certainty and purpose. Lynn offers a free strategic clarity call where you can discuss your family's challenges, explore opportunities for growth, and identify meaningful next steps. To learn more or schedule your free call, visit elevatehowyounavigate.com. Because when parents have clarity, they can navigate with confidence, and that can make all the difference in the world. First, I would like to mention MAYU water. If you're trying to upgrade your hydration, MAYU uses a vortex flow system that mimics how water naturally moves in rivers and streams. That motion helps increase oxygenation and release unwanted gases like chlorine, improving overall water quality and making it easier to stay consistently hydrated. But here's what most people overlook. Hydration isn't just about water. It's about minerals and absorption. MAYU allows you to remineralize your water with essential minerals and electrolytes, supporting cellular hydration, energy levels, and overall physiological balance. When your water has the right structure and mineral content, your body can actually use it more efficiently. If you care about hydration, performance, or just feeling better day to day, this is one of those simple upgrades that adds up. You can get 10% off with the code AUTISM. Next, Daylight Computer Company and Daylight Kids. These devices are designed to work with your brain, not against it. And honestly, the future of tech is already here. Most screens are built for stimulation, bright, fast, and attention-grabbing. But that often leads to eye strain, mental fatigue, and disrupted sleep. Daylight takes a different approach. By reducing blue light and lowering overall sensory load, these devices support sustained focus, calmer attention, and healthier sleep patterns. For anyone who feels drained after screen time, or for kids whose nervous systems are still developing, this creates a much more natural, regulated way to engage with technology. If you want your tech to support your brain instead of overstimulating it, this is worth checking out. Use code AUTISM for $50 off. And finally, Chroma light devices, lights designed for humans. Natural light contains a full spectrum that our brains and bodies are tuned to. But most modern indoor lighting falls short of that. It's often narrow, harsh, and out of sync with how we're designed to experience light. Chroma is built to bring that balance back. These lights are designed to better reflect the qualities of natural light, supporting your circadian rhythm, reducing sensory strain, and creating environments that feel calmer and more aligned. That can translate into better sleep, more stable energy, and a nervous system that isn't constantly being pushed toward overload. If you have ever felt off under certain lighting and didn't know why, this is worth exploring. Get 10% off with the code AUTISM. If you're optimizing your environment, your focus, your well-being, your nervous system, these products are worth checking out.